argument was brought up about how we can all learn to farm and grow our own food, but not all of us can learn to be doctors, to treat other people. And while that's true to some extent, it's also true that many of us, all of us, can heal ourselves from many diseases. Most of us will not suffer from a debilitating disease that we cannot overcome, not one that will cripple us for life or kill us, but we do require food every day on a regular basis if we want to continue to survive. And it's often the results of large-scale farming, the fact that it's often not possible to farm and meet those requirements for consumption in a world that is constantly growing, that constantly demands more and more food and more agricultural products without the specialized knowledge of farmers. If we don't have things, for example, crop rotation, irrigation, to be able to create bigger fields, and we don't have harvesters, tractors, tons of other equipment, and the specific knowledge from these individuals to use that equipment, we're not going to be able to meet those demands. And people, no matter where they are going to starve, and we're not going to be able to sustain small villages to the largest population centers in the world. Another argument was the idea that pesticides were associated with large-scale farming, and those health effects that are associated are going to necessitate more doctors. Now, farmers constantly have to develop improved farming practices. That means that we're taking out pesticides and replacing them with things that are going to be healthier for people, that's going to produce more food, and it's ultimately going to make a process that is going to satisfy the needs of the people in terms of agriculture. And these farming practices also have to improve greater yield. So even if we can't eliminate the role of pesticides, it's important to note that being able to have that agricultural productivity that we have today, that's something that's ultimately more important due to the number of people that need to have that in order to survive. One of the greatest, deadliest diseases in the world is malnutrition. And farmers combat that everywhere, no matter where they are, by providing more and more food at ever cheaper prices, without geographic limitations, helping everybody in the world without the specificity of Doctors Without Borders.
All right, I'm going to talk about the next half of arguments that we heard from our opponents. So the next argument that we heard from Ms. Ann Tran was the topic of polio. And she essentially tried to justify the universal benefit of doctors by talking about one specific vaccine and one specific case within an extreme circumstance. And we have a couple points of refutation to this. Firstly, we would say that that is a scientist, not a doctor, that came up with that vaccine for polio. Just like how it was a scientist, not a doctor, that came up with the solution to most medical problems. Something that we want to specify and differentiate on our side of the debate is the difference between actually executing the industry and the research and development sector of that industry. We would call doctors part of the execution side of the medical industry, but we wouldn't call the scientists who develop vaccines as part of that. Similarly, within the agricultural field, we would call farmers part of the executing side of the industry, and that's the kind of occupation we want to talk about. But we wouldn't be talking about the kind of agricultural scientists that allowed for the Green Revolution. And if we ever did talk about that, if we did meet them on that definition, then you essentially need to thank 80% of all of you within planet Earth for being here. Because it was these scientists within the agricultural industry that allowed the majority of us to actually have enough food to survive. But we don't want to talk about that side of the debate. We only want to talk about people who actually execute that industry, not the scientists and the researchers and the developers that go behind it. So we don't really think that that point necessarily is an argument for doctors, but necessarily just a case for scientists. So we don't really think that point applies. The second argument that we heard, or the last argument that we heard from Ms. Ann Tran, is the concept of Doctors Without Borders. Again, a specific example to talk in an attempt to justify universal benefit and universal legitimacy of doctors. But we also have arguments against this. What we would say is that we think that it's quite telling that Ms. Ann Tran specifically talks about an organization that is dedicated towards helping people all around the world. Because she understands that most of the doctors who exist in society aren't able to help everyone around the world. It is impossible for a doctor to export his or her own surgeries. But what we do recognize is that farmers on a daily basis help individuals all over the world through concepts like exportation, through concepts like international business commerce. We think that the kind of benefits that we hear from Ms. Ann Tran about universal benefit and Doctors Without Borders and helping people on the other side of the fence is already already a universal given when you talk about farmers. Because like I said, the definition of a farmer is no longer just about self-subsistence. It's not just about feeding your own family. It's also about feeding the families of countless other nations around the world. That is a characteristic that applies to all farmers that pretty much applies to 99% of farmers, but only applies to a very small, very specialized group of doctors that Ms. Anne Tran talks about. So we think that even though that argument is justified, we don't necessarily think it stacks up to the kind of benefits we've given you about farmers. Thank you.